right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We're really excited to have Astrid County and Johnny Rezvani here to conduct this workshop centering equity in Passive House today. And we're really happy that you're here as well to participate. Everything we do at the Accelerator is made possible by the support of our sponsors. So I want to give a shout out to them for their generous support. Our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingwe Architects, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification, RDH Building Science, Rockwool North America, StoCorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. Thanks to our patron sponsors, Aero Barrier, BR+A Consulting Engineers, Brennan Air Tightness and Insulation, Inotech Windows and Doors, and US Engineered Wood T-Stud. So, Astrid County joins us from Houston, Texas, where she's a user researcher for Holochain, a company designing sustainable systems for web infrastructure. She's also the former Climate Tech Fellow for On Deck in San Francisco. Johnny Rezvani joins us from Boulder, Colorado. You may know him as the Director of Communications for 475 High Performance Building Supply, or as a board member for the Colorado Green Building Guild. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Astrid and Johnny. Thank you.
Thank you, and good to be here, and thanks for having this forum, creating this space. I'm going to be sharing my screen now, and let me make sure that that looks good. Do we all see it? Okay, great. So centering equity in Passive House. This first off, we just want to mention this is a presentation developed in collaboration with an initiative called the Centering Equity and Sustainable Building Sector Initiative from the NAACP, which is a group that meets online and has been throughout the pandemic. And I've seen many Passive House folks in there before, and so this is kind of some of those concepts leaking out from one into the other. So this is what we're looking for. In terms of the vision, we're looking for encouraging a Passive House community that reflects the diversity of the society that it serves and operates in, and the idea that we, as the community that we are, because of the work that we do, because of the type of people we are, to take on Passive House and be audacious enough to think that we can make a big difference in the world, that we're the right ones to lead the construction industry in other ways as well, including equity and bringing it back to the triple bottom line that underlies everything within green building. Let's introduce ourselves. It skipped ahead, sorry.
Cool. Hi, I'm Astrid County. I'm drawn to this work because of my background in technology and climate and community, and I'm really passionate about building sustainable and ethical futures that are rooted in strong communities.
And I'm Johnny Rezvani, and as you mentioned, from 475 High Performance Building Supply. And part of the reason I was drawn to equity, diversity work in particular is being from the Ferguson-Florissant area of St. Louis, which I probably haven't talked with a lot of people about, but being from there and seeing Ferguson turn into the national stage that it did was hugely impactful. But before that, even when I was in high school, a lot of my roots in this came from the fact that I worked for the city at the time, and in 2000 there was discovered to be a huge collaboration between real estate and several different entities, including in local government, to actively redline that community. And that was not that long ago. So that was like a very formative experience that helped me understand as I was growing up, wow, this is a thing that happens in the world. So that's that. And I just went over the vision.
So why we're here today. We're here to help build some connections in the Passive House movement. And we know that there's a lot of ambitious goals. We want to help you all move toward those goals and include equity, to ask members of the Passive House community to challenge themselves. We also recognize this is not easy work. We don't want to give the impression that you just tick a few boxes and you're done. This requires a change in thinking, and it also flips some things upside down. But we're going to offer you some ideas about what that challenge will look like, and also some resources to help you as you start thinking about this, and as well to commit to some actions to build up the next generation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color professionals. Because as we'll talk about in the presentation, this is the next wave of people moving into this industry, and we want to help to make sure that there's some room for them as they start to graduate and look for their roles and try to figure out how they're going to contribute.
And it's something that we've mentioned in previous iterations of this presentation, just that neither of us are especially specialists on this issue. We're just people who think about this a lot and are kind of wanting to create this space. So we're not creating this, we don't live in a top-down community in that way. We live in this, in the Passive House world, we're all about open exchange of ideas. And this is a new set of ideas that we want to sort of just bring to the surface and begin dialogues on. So before we get into the meat of it, just some definitions off the bat. What is equity? How does it differ from equality? I know when I was growing up, we always said equality, not equity. And at some point it kind of shifted. And so I like this graphic because it kind of shows the essence of it, which is that equality, we all get the same. If we're plants in this world, we all get the same environment. We all do fine, some better, some worse. But equity, the idea is that we need different environments to help everyone grow in the way that they need. Some need more water, some need more sun. And that's, sort of the basics of it, that a just and fair inclusion into society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential.
So centering equity, so what does that really mean? What we really want you to come away from this with is that we don't want this idea of equity to become another thing on your to-do list. We really want this to be something that is integrated into everything that you're already doing. So here we talk about how carbon and energy use may be the center of our orbit, but how do we make sure that justice and equity don't become Pluto, which we know Pluto has its own controversy, but the idea being that doesn't become something that can kind of get lost, forgotten about. We were working on it and now we can't because we're too busy or new things have happened. What we really want to do is help you understand that the best way to approach this is to think about it as a part of what you do, period. And that doesn't require some changes in some ways, but it's something that we think is very doable. And we want to make sure that we help to give resources to all of you to make that real for you.
And, we need to remember where we started. I know when I took my very first sustainability classes, literally the definition of sustainability that was given to me was the triple bottom line, that it was people, planet, and profit, and the balance of those things. And I know that in the real world, what I see every day, you can't forget profit because we all run businesses. We all have to keep those businesses going. So you can't forget that part. Planet, that's why we do a lot of what we do. And then the people part can easily kind of fall away, whether that be the justice elements of it or literally just taking care of ourselves in this process and our, the people within our own businesses and things like that. Oftentimes we're the quickest to say, hey, I can give too much of myself because I need to take care of all these other things. So it's important to remember that it's a balance of the three.
And a big part of this is that building is not a neutral act. So what this really is talking about is everything that has happened in our world, good and bad, was by design. And a big part of Passive House is trying to build new opportunities for a different sort of world. And so when thinking of that, we really do have to be very conscious of how we do things. So we literally build with the goal to change the world. And in order to think about how we want to change the world, we have to become very intentional about the process that we take to do that. So gentrification and exclusion, those things were built into our society. And we want to make sure that as we're moving forward, that we do things to make sure that that doesn't continue. And that we have some, we all have some examples of unjust practices that we can draw upon to think about this maybe more personally. But I think the big part of this particular slide is just there really is no neutral act when it comes to making anything new in this world, but especially in something as personal as homes that we want people to be able to live in and thrive in. It's very important that we really think critically about all the pieces that go into making that.
And I can highly recommend the images. In fact, we could drop that link in the chat at some point, or we'll have it in the resources document afterwards. But this film, Segregated by Design, is just a fantastic summary of how the United States became segregated by design and the kind of efforts that are required to undo that intentionally. So within the broader engineering, architecture, construction world, just pulled up some numbers on the current situation in terms of diversity. And historically, as we know, anybody who's been in an architecture school historically have skewed white and male. Passive House is no exception. We don't have numbers on this at this point, and that's actually a problem too. We kind of looked around for how to quantify people within the Passive House world, but it's not like we've done these sort of surveys before. So we're kind of estimating that about 75% of the current Passive House community, if you're looking across North America, are white men between the ages of 35 and 55. Which if we were all, instead of being this dispersed group, collection of different entities all across North America, if we were one big company and that was the case, you can imagine the headlines would not be great, but that's why sort of we don't get that sort of focus inward, is because we're not a monolith. We're not one company. We're many, many different ones. And so we sort of have to approach this as a collective in the way that we do with many different things within, sharing ideas and developing new ways of approaching this. So, so the problem at its center is the Passive House movement needs to be more inclusive if we want this to succeed as a whole. If we really truly believe that this is a solution that the entire nation can have, we got to grow our bubble is essentially what it comes to. And growing our bubble means starting from within in order to grow without. And so pulling some other stats from 2020 NCARB by the Numbers report, which had a lot of good stats on architects in particular. African American women make up about 1.1% of the workforce in building construction and less than 1% of licensed architects. The flip side to that is that, as we sort of referenced earlier, nearly 2 in 5 new architects are women, and over half of those new women architects are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And, and so we're seeing, as we said, sort of the next generation coming in is just naturally going to be looking different than the generations before, because it is more open. There are more programs out there encouraging women and people of color to get into STEM fields. And so that's, part of what we're saying is that we need to be part of that wave.
And that also means recognizing and understanding structural racism. So it's called structural because it doesn't require a particular person to do something. The system is actually built this way. One of the ways I like to think of it is, if you were to ask a fish about any of the obstacles stopping them from getting somewhere, the last thing they'd probably talk to you about is the water, because it's all around them. It's something that it's just the way that they live. It's not necessarily something they're intentionally trying to affect. So because the racism is structural, it's up to us to actually do things to make changes. So like Passive House, this has to be a team sport where each of us is involved, and no one can really afford to be a spectator. Because it is structural, it does mean that it can feel very overwhelming and very huge. And no one is asking that one of us figure out how to solve structural racism. But what we all can do is find ways to take the little bits of power that we may have and make different types of choices and different decisions, especially understanding that structural racism is always at play, and that if we don't make any actual changes or conscious choices, then it will be a part of what's happening and will be a part of some of the effects that you're seeing.
And so this graphic is sort of demonstrating that fact. This graphic is from a brainstorming event that happened with the Centering Equity and Sustainable Building sector group from NAACP when they had a retreat at one point where people sort of graphically put on the board all the different aspects of equity that needed to be addressed in building standards. And this kind of just sums up like how overwhelming it can get when you're like, maybe you're reading books about this, you're reading articles all the time in the newspaper, you're reading things, a lot of is coming at us in this about this content, about equity in diversity across the board, not just within building, but within business, within corporate environments. And so it can just feel like, how could I possibly do all these things? And so where do you start? You start where you have decision-making power. And that's the point at which you really need to look inward, is what do I actually have control over? What can I actually change in the world?
And we want to remind you that we've already started. So within building standards, there's the Living Building Challenge that considers equity a core imperative. There's also Architecture 2030, where equity is now part of their commitment, and justice and equity are also built into the framework of the UN sustainability goals. So there are also many, many more people who've been working on issues of diversity and equity and inclusion for years. And all this is just to remind you that there are lots of people out there already in communities, already doing a lot of this work. So there are many, many resources and other ways for you to be able to learn about next steps that you can take and maybe things that you can consider. This ball has already been rolling. So don't be discouraged or embarrassed even. Be willing to raise your hand and ask questions and ask for help, because there's lots of people out there who are wanting to help you.
There's templates for how this is being done across sustainable building in general. There's the one that I mentioned, the NAACP initiative that this grew out of. There's organizations like the National Organization of Minority Architects, Beyond the Built Environment, Open Architecture Collaborative, which has many different branches all across the US, National Society of Black Engineers, Blue Green Alliance. There's the list goes on and on. We're actually going to have a long list in the resources document. And so part of this idea is you should not be thinking that you're starting from scratch, even if you feel like you are within your organization. There is tons of resources out there if you start looking and you start putting out your hand to invite people to join you in this process. And also you may have started down this pathway within your organization. So that's another part of it. Something to mention at this point is that this presentation and also this concept of having this challenge sort of put out within the Passive House community. We have run this through leadership from FIAS and NAPHN both, and have basically, they're going to be creating more opportunities for this discussion in conferences, starting now and into the future, and as well as taking on these sorts of challenges within the organization themselves. So I'm sure you're going to be seeing more from both organizations working together to see that this becomes part of the challenge that we create for ourselves within the Passive House world.
So let's build on these concepts. Passive House and NetZero building, they were established with the fair share principle to set limits and share the surplus with others. The requirements of Passive House standards look only at energy, but collectively, we've been able to focus on low embodied carbon materials. And these equity initiatives can work similarly to affirm moving from business as usual to low embodied carbon commitments. So there's a lot of great foundations already laid with which these types of issues around equity and diversity and inclusion can easily be stacked upon them as you start to build towards the goals that you have.
Right. Nobody's requiring any of us to think about low embodied carbon materials. We have just started doing that. I mean, and how you can't get through a presentation these days without hearing about, well, what's the carbon balance of that? And this can be the same sort of thing. We have a pattern for taking on these things that we know are right, and no one's requiring of us. Like we're those people who take that kind of thing on. So there is a pathway for what that looks like, and it looks similar to that. And it is stuck again. There we go. So now we're going to talk about basically the framework for commitment to taking action. And that framework is essentially breaking it up into 3 different areas that hold up a sort of a proper equity campaign within your organization or firm or within any groups that you belong to. And that is basically hiring practices, dedicating funds, and internal transformation. So we're going to start off by kind of giving a few examples. And again, this is not every example that we could think of. This is just some that we thought were best suited to the world that we're in, which is organizations and firms that are smaller, that maybe don't have an HR department, that are maybe 5 to 20 people. That's typically the type of firm that I work with on a daily basis. And if you are at a bigger firm, you have somebody who's probably you already have someone who's a diversity, equity, inclusion officer of some kind who's running campaigns in your company. But so this is sort of offering solutions for areas that could need addressing.
So the first one is dedicating funds. And the main thing to remember about this is that projects that have a budget are the ones that get priority. And if it has some funds associated with it, then it should be measured. It's really important that with anything related to equity and diversity and inclusion, that is where those initiatives start. So funds can go to things like sponsoring events or developing some scholarships, establishing mentorship relationship programs with emerging professionals that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, dedicating pro bono hours to supporting low-income communities. And there's more, of course. But the main thing here is to really put your money where your mouth is and measure it.
And then the next category is implementing hiring practices. So, changing hiring criteria, previous experience may be a barrier. Sometimes one of the things, if you're looking to invite a whole new group of people that maybe haven't had the offer before, maybe haven't had the opportunity before to work in a certain area, a lot of people can get scared off by the, must have 10 years experience in something. That can be very off-putting to somebody who maybe has the skills that you need, but have nowhere near 10 years of experience in the category that you're talking about. So one area that you can affect is sort of say exactly what you need rather than proxies to measure that competency. So I found in my own work, that when I'm hiring to help out in the marketing department, a degree is not necessary at all to help me out. I find that actually, just having good work examples that somebody can send me and show that, yeah, they would make a great fit based on this work example that they sent me is more important to me than having a degree that, sort of is a proxy really for the skill. Advertising job openings with organizations that you haven't advertised with before. A big part of what we're talking about here is very simply just reaching out a hand to these many, many different organizations that are interested in equity and diversity within the sustainability world, really, not just buildings, but all of the sustainability world, and putting job openings out there with people that you don't always put it out there with. That's an excellent way. A lot of it is an invitation. Establishing ways to have equity first approaches to bringing in contractors and partners who specifically share your values in terms of equity and centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color employees. And these are all sort of things that kind of fit into that category.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind that we forgot to put on there was also, no, it's okay, Johnny. It's to stay in your job advertisement that if you don't have all of this, please apply. or that you welcome people who maybe have a different set of experiences and have them apply. There's a lot of research that shows that especially women and people who are in marginalized communities they usually hold themselves to a higher standard. So when they're looking at whatever the job description is, if they don't believe they have 90% of it, they're not going to apply. So sometimes having that reminder that even if you don't fit everything, we're still welcoming your application is also another way that you can draw somebody in who maybe would look over it and say, I'm not a good fit for this.
Oh yeah, do you want to
I can
continue on?
continue. Yeah. So
Yeah.
internal transformation. So take on the job as designers and developers of Passive House projects to measure the social impacts of our work. I think that's a really important thing that is not happening universally right now, but is a really important part of how in the future you're going to look back and be able to see the difference that is made when you're doing any type of effort towards including people or making more equity in your work. So make sure diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives also report to your CEO or whoever is running your firm. The reason why that's a big deal is because sometimes what happens is that people who are hired and they do the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, they're still reporting up through a structure where they don't have a lot of opportunity for their work to permeate throughout the company. And what you want is, if you do have a position like that, you want that person to have direct access to the decision maker. And in most cases, that would be the CEO, whoever is running the organization. And you don't want that to go through a filter where things may be changed or maybe completely left out, which can make a really big difference in the success of the initiatives. Understand the role you personally play in the DEI initiatives at your workplace. So this is important because oftentimes, if you do have someone fulfilling this role in your company, it can become kind of like, that's not my job, that's their job. But in order for diversity and equity and inclusion to really work, everyone has a role to play. You will need someone to help guide you, but that doesn't mean that it can be offloaded onto someone else. And so it does help to have some understanding of your particular role. And if you do not know for sure, then there's other resources that you can have to help you understand that. But to make sure that you are actively working with whomever is internal or external to your organization so that you don't offload that process, which can happen sometimes not even by intention, but will happen if you don't focus on it. Undertake internal collective analysis to identify and transform systemic barriers and cultural characteristics that reinforce exclusionary outcomes. So that's a lot of words to say. Sometimes our internal cultures are doing things that can make people who are minorities or who are underrepresented feel unwelcome. It's really hard to know that if you're not actively looking in your organization and questioning why certain things are happening. It doesn't always mean that it's being done in an intentional way, but there are definitely little tweaks that can be made that can make a big difference. And some of these things can be very simple, like if you're part of an organization where maybe you all go out to happy hour and somebody doesn't drink, that can make them feel not included. So little things can make a big difference, but it's important that you actually do some analysis to find out what's working, what's not working. Offer free and inclusive trainings on Passive House design and projects in action to groups outside of your typical target market. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't even know anything about Passive House. And especially these days where there's a really raging real estate market, it's a bit of a shame that this is not something that the general public is a little more aware of. So that means that there's a lot more work that can be done to make it more apparent to those who might be looking for this type of solution, but also for people who would be a part of this community if they knew it existed. And then make the goals SMART, which is part of what we've been talking about, to make sure that you're measuring it, make sure that it's something that's achievable, make sure that it's something that's specific, very relevant, and time-based. I think is also really important. It's really hard to meet goals that are like, one day we'll be able to do this. You want something that is in the same vein as you would treat many other things that have a budget. They're usually done monthly, quarterly, at the most yearly. So you want to make sure that these goals are set in that same sort of time frame.
And so now we're coming to the part where we're going to do a little interaction. basically we have a worksheet that we're going to be putting out in the chat and that we're going to use as a framework to have a bit of discussion in small groups. And so in these three categories that we just talked about, hiring practice, dedicating funds, internal transformation, there is no one size fits all. We're not going to be able to tell you which parts of these you're able to do and what not do. It's going to be different for everybody. And so we're going to send out this worksheet to review in your group. You're going to share your name, company, anything that you have currently going on that fit these categories of what we're talking about, and any aspects that you're checking out in this worksheet to see, oh, we could actually make that happen. Things that could be actionable tomorrow, things that you could suggest at your next all team meeting. And then we're going to report back and talk about some of the things that come up in those small groups, and then basically have a Q&A at that point. Now, before we do jump into those small groups, we want to emphasize that this is not that you're making a to-do list. The idea is that you're making a foundation, because we want to weave these aspects of what we're talking about into standard business practice in some way, so that it's not a new list that you're creating, that it's actually just a question that gets asked while you're accomplishing the things that you accomplish on a daily basis. So I want to put it out there. I found an actually really great study just recently that is by the Center for Talent Innovation that did a study on majority men and their support of diversity, equity, inclusion in the workforce, and finding that these days, most men actually support, which is different than the past, actually support these initiatives in the workplace. That's sort of changed immensely over the last few years, especially. The biggest response now to men not being involved, majority men in particular not being involved, is simply, I'm too busy, and feeling like it is just another to-do list thing. And so that's why we emphasize that we're not just making things to check off. We're trying to suggest new partnerships, new people, new questions that get asked in your daily practice, and how we weave that into the fabric of the organization. So, basically, you really want to see yourself in this story. So like, you're imagining the story of how your organization makes this transition, and you're seeing where you fit within that. And you don't need to have all the answers. You want to invite new perspectives to the table. You want a broader, more diverse workforce, so that you can broaden and diversify who's finding out about Passive House and who is building Passive House across North America. And basically, our bubble needs to grow. So at this point, we are going to jump into these small groups. I think it's going to be groups of 4, and let's make sure that we have the document in here. We are gonna go send it. I don't know if you already dropped it in, but I'm dropping it in to everyone right now. So this is our worksheet document, and then we can also drop them in as we break out. It looks like people are jumping in there now. So basically, this worksheet, it's also something you could save and use separately, because it basically summarizes a lot of what we just talked about: the vision, the challenge to the Passive House community, and sort of breaking out those 3 different areas. And so again, jump in, share your name, the company, anything you're currently doing, and anything that this worksheet sort of inspires that you could take action on soon. So with that, I think we can let it rip. And